That's the kind of sophisticated decision-making that is emerging because of this deglobalization trend. And it's happening everywhere. So the Indians are doing it, the Germans are doing it, and then the US is doing it. And then on top of that, what they're doing in terms of game theory, which I think is even more sophisticated, is they're not letting China be alone. They're actually now slowing China down. Because China, turns out, actually needs inputs from these Western economies. And they're like, we're just not going to give them to you anymore. So do the best you can.
In his most recent podcast, Chamath Palihapitiya discussed the big tech starts making cuts, and what this means for the broader economy and startups. Chamath shared his thoughts about global debt numbers, Fed incompetency and more. Before listening to him, please ensure to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let's dive into his last interview now.
I think it appeals to the insecure overachiever elite. Nobody building anything really gives a shit about Davos. Nobody is thinking what's going on. Nobody even knows when it happens.
Right.
So who cares about it? People who like status and went to fancy schools and wants to feel like they're in the club, and that's how they've made it, is going to this place, which underneath is a membership organization where people pay based on the number of people that get to go. So is it really that important? Substantively, no. But overachieving surplus elites in the West really value the signal that it represents to other overachieving surplus elites in the West. So that's what Davos is. That's what the Allen and Company conference has become. A lot of these things started off much purer than what they are today. But these are all membership-driven, revenue-generating efforts. In 30 or 40 years, the All-In Summit will probably become that too. It's just the nature of things. So I wouldn't spend so much time focused on a group of people getting together. The funniest thing about Davos that I saw was Zero Hedge, which said that the amount of prostitution is at record levels in Davos. And so it just kind of boils down to what it is, which is like any other conference. It just happens to be with more security guards than less security guards. And the same stupid stuff happens at Davos that happens in Vegas at Name Your Conference, CES. It's just a different kind of attendee. So I think the bigger thing is that we are learning that the world tends to have these policy perspectives that swing in a pendulum. And the problem with the pendulum is that it is at extremes. And Sachs is right. We went from an extreme where we were very closed off and we were essentially subsistence farmers. All of us were. And then the pendulum has essentially peaked probably in the mid-teens of this decade or of this century, where we realized too much globalization actually hollows out local economies. So we need to find the equilibrium point. And that inherently has more inflation, that inherently has higher prices, and that inherently has slower progress, but more consistent progress that benefits more people. And this is what is so ideologically disruptive to, again, surplus elites, because they need the $600 iPhone. The idea that they can't upgrade every year drives them into such a tizzy that they need to export all the jobs. Whereas a $1,000 iPhone or a $1,500 iPhone may just mean that your upgrade cycle is 2 years. And just ask yourself, how many times have you upgraded as soon as the phone came out to realize, man, this phone is actually worse than the previous version? And I probably could have just waited. And there's a lot of work that actually goes into building these things to actually make them better. So all you're doing is you're giving up optionality. You're allowing your brothers and sisters to struggle to basically feed the profit motives of one company. That, in hindsight, doesn't need to happen. So there's an equilibrium. And I think that these next few decades will be about finding it. We have decided, it's categorical, that that level of globalization that we have had, this unitary, singular, monocultural way of thinking about things, is over. And David's right. It's because that system has created too many threats to the hegemony that brought us there. Yeah. It'll be more prosperity for more people, but it'll be slower, and it will create points of friction that are represented in inflation and higher prices. With the amount of discontent and the amount of economic strain that people feel, if you want to really quell populism, you're going to have to create economic vibrancy at home. When people are making money and they find purpose, They're less agitated. They're not storming the Capitol. They're not electing fringe candidates. They're not doing domestic terrorism. They're just going to work and building a life, right? We know that. So how can we afford not to? How can we afford not to bring back jobs to the heartland of America? So the reality that I have, and I think a lot of people have, is that this debt to GDP thing is a bit of an intellectual red herring. And the reason is people talk about this thing constantly in these absolute terms with no historical precedent that relates well to our current moment. There is no magic number at which this experiment that's called America fails. So I think that you have to be a little bit more intellectually honest and say that at best it's a relative problem. And it's relative to the countries that have already established dominance, of which there are 8 or 9, and then the emerging economies, and then thinking about what critical things will they bring to the table in 15 or 20 years from now. And in that context, I think that people will hem and haw, but ultimately they'll capitulate, they will raise the debt ceiling, and they'll continue to fund this transition away from globalism. And I think that's the argument that will get the Republicans over the line, because it's going to bring a lot of spending and stimulus and jobs to, frankly, a lot of red states that would otherwise kind of continue to wither and die on the vine. For example, let's take natural resources, okay? Every time you do a plan, the industry, and I define the industry as every for-profit company and Wall Street and the debt markets, they refuse to underwrite this thing at a higher cost of capital. They use a WACC of 6 or 7 or 8, and they will fight tooth and nail to use the smallest discount rate possible, because it allows them to capture more of the profit dollars. But if you actually had a realistic WACC of 10% on a massive infrastructure project, guess what? You're actually pretty equivalent to a government. And in fact, in many cases, a government becomes cheaper. So I think the thing that is worth debating, and I'd like your reaction to this, it's not that what you're saying. It's we refuse to change the guardrails on our profit-making ability. And if you extended the window, if you changed the discount rate, if you said PEs can be different, you would have a very different economic justification for what you just said. It completely changes 100 basis points, changes everything you're saying by tens of years. Even if energy is zero in China, you have to think about inputs, meaning factories make things with inputs. And if you look, for example, in natural resources, the inputs by and large don't exist in China. And so all I'm saying is that all of these inputs, whether again, you can take natural resources that proliferate massively in the United States. It turns out that India is utterly poorly addressed in a geographical survey perspective. And we're finding that India's raw resources are off the charts. Okay. There's certain places in Africa, tons of stuff in Indonesia and Australia. All of those things may not have to go to China because there are subsidies or there are equivalently cheaper decisions that governments can make so that they choose not to send it. And all of a sudden, all of that spending doesn't matter as much because the Australian government makes a trade-off that says, you know what, I'd rather have these jobs here, and I'm willing to have a longer payback cycle for these jobs to be here, than instead of ship it to China. And they tell the Australian citizens, I'm sorry guys, but you're going to have to replace your car every 7 years as opposed to every 5. I hope you're okay with that, but that'll mean full employment. And it'll prevent fringe candidates and populism.
Where do you invest?
I am investing a lot of money in those places that control the natural resources that are poorly understood. Meaning, there are places like India where our geological survey capacity is relatively naive. And it turns out that in critical parts of the energy supply chain or other places, they can play a huge role. And the Indian government's cost of capital has an element, they're sophisticated enough to add an element to the formula that accounts for full employment. If I build it in this state, and if I try to get this many jobs created, the full circle feedback of that allows me to actually transfer price it into the Indian market at this price, which is cheaper than anything that China can do, even at zero energy. That's the kind of sophisticated decision-making that is emerging because of this deglobalization trend. And it's happening everywhere. So the Indians are doing it. The Germans are doing it. And then the US is doing it. And then on top of that, what they're doing in terms of game theory, which I think is even more sophisticated, is they're not letting China be alone. They're actually now slowing China down. Because China, turns out, actually needs inputs from these Western economies. And they're like, we're just not going to give them to you anymore. So do the best you can. For example, in semiconductors, the Dutch, the Germans, the Americans, we've now essentially embargoed all of our most sophisticated equipment from ever getting in there. That will increase, even with zero energy, the cost of what comes out of there. And that will balance the playing field so that the Germans, the Dutch, the Americans can bring other partners in at a different cost of capital to make it economically neutral and at parity. And the reason they'll do it is to create jobs for Americans or the Dutch or for the Germans. Yeah. Somebody should do it in accounting. Somebody should learn all of GAAP accounting, which is pretty simple because it's published, FASB, all of this nonsensical accounting rules, and give you 100% guarantee of no malfeasance. So, for example, you guys saw this Brazilian company.
You want AI accounting? That's your.
Yeah, well, look at this company,
Logis outcome.
Logis,
AI
like
diligence.
Look at this company, Americanas in Brazil, which just torched $20 billion of enterprise value. Why? Because these guys were using Excel to do a bunch of complicated capitalization and cost accounting, made 2 or 3 years of mistakes. It added up to $2 or $3 billion, and they're basically going to file bankruptcy in the next few days. That's completely avoidable human error that should never happen. And an AI would be perfect for that. Like, this is not super controversial to just follow GAAP accounting. The problem is the database exists today. Like, everybody sits on top of Oracle GL or Workday. It doesn't prevent these errors. So my point is, you got to get humans out of the system, and the AI should be the accountant. The AI knows the rules, generates the P&L, and says, this is it. And by the way, that's way better risk management for the CEO and the CFO, because as you guys know, if you're the CEO of a public company, you have to sign your signature that these things are legitimate.
And how do you know? Right?
I would way better know that a computer did it. Like, an OpenAI algorithm tells me, Chamath, this P&L is perfect, than some dude I don't know at Ernst & Young.